On the night of November 21st, 1963, just hours before President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson whispered a chilling promise to his secret mistress: "After tomorrow, those Kennedys will never embarrass me again." The woman who heard those words was Madeleine Brown. For decades, she lived under the constant threat of Secret Service intimidation, forced into total silence to protect one of the most ruthless political conspiracies in American history. What really happened on the eve of the murder that shocked the world? Madeleine Duncan Brown was born on July 5th, 1925. From a young age, Madeleine possessed a personality that clashed with this rigidity. She was naturally extroverted, highly observant, and physically striking. She learned early how to read people, adjusting her behavior to meet the expectations of her parents, while quietly developing a fierce internal ambition. At W.H. Adamson High School, she was not just a student, she was a networker. She used her intelligence and natural charisma to build social capital. She was articulate and quick-witted, learning how to charm authority figures and peers alike. She cultivated a polished exterior, a skill that would later become her primary survival mechanism, but her carefully constructed life derailed violently at the age of 19. Madeleine married James Glenn Brown, a young man she had known since childhood. James was a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. On paper, the marriage aligned perfectly with the expectations of her Catholic upbringing. In reality, it was a sudden, devastating plunge into chaos. James returned from his military service profoundly damaged. He suffered from chronic paranoid schizophrenia. He self-medicated his terrifying internal delusions with massive quantities of alcohol. The man Madeleine married rapidly vanished, replaced by a volatile, dangerous stranger. The domestic violence began almost immediately. It was physical, frequent, and unpredictable. For Madeleine, the transition from a strict but safe childhood home to a daily fight for physical survival was a psychological shock. The abuse shattered her foundational sense of security. She lived in a state of constant hypervigilance, analyzing James's moods, listening to his footsteps, and trying to predict the unpredictable to avoid the next beating. This trauma permanently rewired her psychology. When a person is trapped in a cycle of severe abuse, their brain prioritizes immediate survival over long-term logic. Madeleine learned that she was physically powerless. She learned that the rigid rules of her upbringing offered no protection behind closed doors. Most importantly, the chronic fear created a massive, enduring void in her life. It stripped away her autonomy and left her with a desperate subconscious craving for physical and financial security. This trauma-induced vulnerability became a core component of her personality. It left her highly susceptible to individuals who projected absolute authority and control. The marriage reached its inevitable breaking point when James's schizophrenia escalated beyond the confines of their home. His delusions and violent outbursts required total medical intervention. James was forcibly removed from Madeleine's life and committed to a Veterans Administration psychiatric hospital for long-term intensive care. In early 1948, at 23 years old, Madeleine was entirely alone. The illusion of her marriage was over. She was legally separated from an institutionalized husband. She was a single mother entirely responsible for her 2-month-old son, Jimmy Glenn Brown. The Catholic community offered judgment, not salvation. She had no financial safety net, no immediate family wealth to rely on, and an infant who depended on her for survival. Desperation replaced fear. Madeleine needed money. She refused to accept low-wage menial labor. She looked at her skill set. She was highly articulate, intensely persuasive, and knew how to manipulate a room. She targeted the advertising industry. In 1948, Madeleine aggressively pursued and secured a job at Glenn Advertising. She entered the office with a singular, ruthless focus. She absorbed everything. She learned the mechanics of corporate budgets, the psychology of consumer targeting, and the brutal art of the pitch. She worked longer hours than her male counterparts. She used her polished, charming exterior to mask a deeply pragmatic, survival-driven work ethic. Her performance at Glenn Advertising caught the attention of the local broadcasting executives. She was quickly recruited by KLIF, a dominant local radio station. They hired her as a media buyer. This position fundamentally changed her life. As a media buyer, Madeleine was in charge of purchasing, negotiating, and allocating commercial airtime. She was suddenly holding the purse strings for major corporate campaigns. Her daily routine involved high-stakes negotiations with aggressive executives demanding station managers and wealthy business owners. She excelled at it. Madeleine discovered she had a natural talent for transactional leverage. She knew how to push for better rates, how to secure prime broadcasting slots, and how to close deals. She built an extensive Rolodex. Her job required her to attend client dinners, corporate events, and high-level meetings. The transformation was stark. In private, she was a traumatized single mother fighting to keep her head above water, legally bound to a schizophrenic husband. In public, she was a sharp, impeccably dressed media executive, operating at the center of the city's communications network. She had successfully compartmentalized her trauma, using her career as a shield. She had built a new, powerful identity, but this aggressive climb up the corporate ladder came with a hidden cost. Her position at KLIF put her in direct daily contact with the men who controlled the city's wealth and political machinery. She was a highly visible, attractive, and unprotected woman navigating an environment ruled by ruthless, powerful men. She had fought her way out of a violent home and secured her financial independence. But in doing so, she walked directly into the crosshairs of a predator who possessed more power than she could possibly comprehend. The Adolphus Hotel in downtown Dallas was the undisputed throne room of Texas power in the late 1940s. Its dark wood paneling, heavy chandeliers, and thick cigar smoke provided the backdrop for the state's most ruthless political and corporate transactions. In late 1948, the Adolphus was the site of a victory celebration that would irreversibly alter the trajectory of Madeleine Duncan Brown's life. The guest of honor was Lyndon B. Johnson. LBJ had just secured his seat in the United States Senate following a deeply controversial and brutally fought Democratic primary. He had won by a mere 87 highly suspect votes, a victory that earned him the sarcastic moniker Landslide Lyndon. But in the Adolphus that night there was no sarcasm. There was only the raw, intoxicating scent of absolute political triumph. LBJ had proven he could bend the system to his will, crush his opponents, and walk away untouched. He was riding a wave of invincibility. She attended the Adolphus party not as a political operative, but in her professional capacity as a media buyer for KLIF radio. She was there to network, to secure advertising contracts, and to ensure her station remained in the good graces of the incoming senator's machine. She was sharp, strikingly attractive, and carried the hardened edge of a single mother who had already survived a violently abusive marriage. but survival instincts are often blind to new, more sophisticated forms of danger. Lyndon Johnson was not a man who observed social boundaries. He was a physical giant who used his size and aggressive demeanor to dominate everyone in his orbit, a tactic that would later become famous as the Johnson treatment. That night at the Adolphus, despite being accompanied by his longtime high-profile mistress, Alice Glass, LBJ locked his sights on Madeleine. The audacity of the moment was a masterclass in psychological dominance. He did not care that the room was packed with journalists, donors, and political rivals. He did not care that his current mistress was watching. He saw a young, beautiful, independent woman operating in his territory, and he decided to claim her. LBJ approached Madeleine with a terrifying combination of charm and absolute authority. He crowded her physical space. He spoke in low, conspiratorial tones, cutting her off from the rest of the room. For Madeleine, the encounter triggered a complex psychological response. Her traumatic marriage to James Glenn Brown had left her with a deep, unfulfilled need for a protector, someone who projected unshakable strength and control. LBJ radiated precisely that kind of power. He was the antithesis of the broken, unpredictable man she had left behind. In that brief, intense conversation at the Adolphus, the trap was set. However, a United States senator does not simply call a young radio executive for a date. The machinery of power requires intermediaries to absorb the risk. Enter Jesse Kellum. Kellum was a central shadowy figure in the Johnson Empire. He was a trusted confidant who managed KTBC, the highly lucrative radio station in Austin owned by LBJ's wife, Lady Bird Johnson. Kellum's job was to protect the senator's interests, both financial and personal. He was the ultimate fixer, a man who operated with total discretion and absolute loyalty. Less than a week after the Adolphus party, Madeleine received a phone call at her KLIF office. It was Jesse Kellum. The pretext was entirely professional. Kellum wanted to discuss broadcasting synergies, advertising rates, and potential collaborations between KLIF and KTBC. It was the perfect cover. A media buyer in Dallas conducting regular business with a station manager in Austin raised zero suspicions, but the subtext of Kellum's call was entirely illicit. He was testing the waters, evaluating Madeleine's discretion, and carefully laying the logistical groundwork for the senator. Kellum established a secure line of communication. He dictated the terms of their interactions. He made it implicitly clear that any relationship with LBJ would be conducted entirely on their schedule, under their rules, and in total secrecy. 3 weeks after the initial encounter at the Adolphus, the first meeting was arranged. The location was the Driscoll Hotel in Austin. The Driscoll was LBJ's true political fortress. It was his operational headquarters, a place where he controlled the staff, the security, and the flow of information. Driving down Highway 81 from Dallas to Austin, Madeleine was crossing a threshold. She was leaving behind the fragile independence she had built at KLIF and driving directly into the epicenter of a political cartel. The mechanics of the affair were cold, precise, and highly managed. Madeleine did not walk through the front lobby of the Driscoll to meet her lover. She followed Kellum's instructions. She used private entrances. She took service elevators. She was ushered into a private suite, entirely removed from the public eye. When the door closed, the illusion of a standard romance evaporated. LBJ was not looking for an equal partner. He was looking for total submission. He used his immense wealth, his political leverage, and his overpowering personality to dismantle Madeleine's remaining autonomy. The psychological entrapment was deeply insidious. LBJ recognized the financial terror that haunted Madeleine as a single mother. He systematically removed that terror by burying it in cash and privileges. He began quietly funneling money to her through untraceable channels. He ensured she had access to luxury goods, high-end clothing, and exclusive social circles. He provided a level of material comfort that a 23-year-old single mother in 1948 could never achieve on her own. But this financial safety net was a heavily fortified cage. The money was not a gift, it was a leash. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, the relationship deepened into a suffocating routine. Madeleine's life split into two irreconcilable halves. By day, she maintained her professional facade in Dallas. She was the sharp, capable media buyer at KLIF, but her private life was entirely dictated by LBJ's political calendar. If the senator had a free window in Austin, Kellum would call. Madeleine was expected to drop everything, her work, her son, her personal plans, and drive south. If LBJ was in Washington, she waited in silence. She was forbidden from contacting him directly. She could not speak his name in public. She could not date other men. She was a ghost in her own life, existing solely to serve the erratic, demanding schedule of a man who viewed her as a possession. The psychological toll of this existence was profound. Madeleine was violently torn between two realities. The fear of poverty and the trauma of her first marriage had driven her to seek security. She had found it in the arms of a U.S. senator. She never had to worry about a medical bill for her son or rent for her apartment. But the cost of that security was the total erasure of her personal freedom. She was no longer an independent woman. She was a highly managed asset in the LBJ portfolio. The true depth of this subjugation culminated in one of the most bizarre and disturbing requirements of her captivity, the sham marriage. As the affair dragged on into the 1950s, Madeleine's unexplained affluence became a liability. A single, divorced woman living well beyond the means of her radio station salary invited unwanted scrutiny. In the highly conservative, gossip-driven society of 1950s Dallas, an unmarried woman with sudden wealth was a target for investigation. The Johnson machine could not afford a scandal. They needed a permanent, legally binding cover story. The solution engineered by LBJ's fixers was chilling in its ruthlessness. Madeleine was instructed to marry again, but this would not be a real marriage. It was a paper shield designed exclusively to deflect the public gaze. Through his extensive network in the Dallas business community, LBJ's operatives identified a local businessman. The details of how this man was coerced into the arrangement remain buried in the dark, but the methods of the Johnson machine were well documented. Whether through financial leverage, political blackmail, or a simple exchange of lucrative favors, the businessman agreed to the terms. He and Madeleine were legally married. They signed the papers, filed the certificates, and presented a respectable facade to the Dallas social scene. She took his name. She wore his ring. The reality behind closed doors was entirely hollow. They never consummated the marriage. They never lived in the same house. They did not share meals, finances, or a life. The businessman served strictly as a decoy. If anyone asked how Madeleine afforded her lifestyle, the answer was simple. She had a successful husband. This 5-year paper marriage was the ultimate manifestation of the gilded cage. Madeleine was legally bound to a ghost to protect the political ambitions of a phantom lover. She sat alone in her well-furnished home, entirely isolated from genuine human connection. The psychological isolation was absolute. She could not confide in her family for fear of their religious judgment. She could not confide in her colleagues for fear of destroying her career. She could only talk to Jesse Kellum, the man assigned to keep her in line. The tragic absurdity of the sham marriage ended years later when the businessman, burdened by his own hidden demons and the bizarre nature of his existence, committed suicide. His death barely registered on the radar of the men who had orchestrated the union. He was simply discarded machinery. But for Madeleine, it was a horrifying reminder of the collateral damage caused by the men she served. By the early 1950s, the trap was fully sprung. Madeleine Duncan Brown had traded the overt physical violence of James Glenn Brown for the covert, systemic violence of Lyndon Baines Johnson. She was financially secure, professionally successful on paper, and completely trapped. She had surrendered her identity, her freedom, and her voice. She was a silent spectator in the theater of her own life, waiting by the phone for Jesse Kellum to give her permission to move. And then the impossible happened. The carefully controlled, meticulously managed system fractured. The ultimate political liability materialized, threatening to tear down the entire empire and placing a target directly on Madeleine's back. The reality of biological consequence does not negotiate with political ambition. In April 1950, the highly controlled, meticulously compartmentalized operation surrounding Madeleine Duncan Brown suffered a catastrophic breach. She discovered she was pregnant. In the modern political landscape, an extramarital affair resulting in a child is a severe scandal, often managed through public relations teams and negotiated settlements. In the deeply conservative, religiously rigid environment of 1950s Texas, it was absolute political suicide. Lyndon B. Johnson was no longer just a newly elected senator. He was actively consolidating his power in Washington, building the alliances that would eventually secure him the role of Senate Majority Leader. He was already calculating the trajectory to the White House. An illegitimate child was a fatal vulnerability. If his political enemies in Texas, a formidable list that included conservative Democrats and oil barons who resented his federal overreach, discovered this pregnancy, LBJ's career would be terminated instantly. When Madeleine relayed the news to LBJ, there was no emotional reconciliation. There was no discussion of shared responsibility or public acknowledgement. LBJ treated the pregnancy as a hostile, tactical threat to his empire. He immediately activated his crisis management network. The primary intermediary, Jesse Kellum, was instructed to step back. The situation required specialized skills that went beyond arranging hotel rooms and managing radio station contracts. It required a man who knew how to manipulate the legal system, bury evidence, and enforce permanent silence. The operation was handed over to Jerome T. Ragsdale. Jerome T. Ragsdale was a prominent, highly connected attorney based in Dallas. He was a cornerstone of the Texas legal establishment and a fierce Johnson loyalist. Ragsdale did not practice the kind of law that involved public courtrooms and grandstanding. He operated in the shadows of civil litigation, property transfers, and discrete settlements. He was a fixer. When Ragsdale took control of Madeleine's situation, he implemented a ruthless, multi-layered containment strategy. The first objective was the falsification of the legal record. Stephen Mark Brown was born in December 1950. The hospital protocols of the era were easily bypassed by a man with Ragsdale's influence. When it came time to fill out the birth certificate, the biological reality was erased. Ragsdale ensured that the document legally identified James Glenn Brown, Madeleine's institutionalized, severely schizophrenic ex-husband, as the father. This was a calculated, legally airtight maneuver. Because James was locked in a Veterans Administration psychiatric ward, he was entirely incapable of contesting the paternity. He was a ghost, repurposed by the Johnson machine to serve as a permanent legal shield. The second objective was physical containment. LBJ could not have his mistress and undocumented son living in precarious financial conditions, where desperation might lead to exposure. Ragsdale was authorized to deploy significant capital to secure Madeleine's silence and compliance. He purchased a house for her in South Windermere, a respectable, quiet neighborhood in Dallas. The property cost $15,000, a substantial sum in 1950, representing solid middle-class stability. It was a spacious 6-room home, designed to keep Madeleine comfortable and out of sight. But Ragsdale did not stop at real estate. He established an untraceable financial pipeline. He provided Madeleine with a full-time live-in maid to assist with the child, and he issued her a series of credit cards with instructions that her living expenses would be covered indefinitely. This financial architecture was not an act of generosity. It was a sophisticated form of extortion. Ragsdale made the terms explicitly clear. Madeleine was provided for under one non-negotiable condition: absolute silence regarding the identity of Stephen's father. Ragsdale stepped into the void to create a second layer of defense. He began visiting the South Windermere house regularly, presenting himself to the neighbors and eventually to young Stephen as a surrogate father figure. He was the one who brought gifts, handled the maintenance of the property, and provided the outward appearance of male stability in the household. By inserting himself directly into the family dynamic, Ragsdale ensured he had constant first-hand surveillance of Madeleine. He monitored who she spoke to, where she went, and how she was managing the pressure. He was the warden of her new life. The psychological reality for Madeleine during the 1950s and 1960s was bleak. She was a mother raising a child entirely on a foundation of lies. Every milestone in Stephen's life, his first steps, his first days of school, his birthdays, was overshadowed by the fact that she was forbidden from telling him who he truly was. She had to instruct her son to call a corporate attorney Uncle Jerome or accept him as a father figure, while the man who actually fathered him was rapidly ascending to the highest levels of global power. As LBJ's power grew, the stakes of Madeleine's silence compounded. When Johnson became John F. Kennedy's vice president in 1961, the level of scrutiny surrounding him intensified. The Secret Service, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, and the National Press Corps were now permanent fixtures in his life. For Madeleine, this meant the containment protocols became even more rigid. The physical encounters with LBJ became increasingly sparse and exponentially more dangerous. They no longer met in easily accessible hotels. The logistics required military-level precision, often involving secure private residences and highly vetted transportation. Despite the physical distance, the threat of ruin never dissipated. Madeleine watched LBJ on television, watching him navigate the Cuban Missile Crisis, the escalating conflict in Vietnam, and the intense domestic battles over civil rights. She knew the man commanding the United States Armed Forces was the same man who had engineered the erasure of her son's identity. The power dynamic was so overwhelmingly disproportionate that the concept of rebellion was mathematically impossible. If she spoke out, she would not just be fighting a politician, she would be fighting the executive branch of the United States government. The turning point in their physical relationship did not come from a political scandal or a change of heart. It came from a brutal physical trauma. In 1967, Madeleine was involved in a severe car accident. Her son Stephen, now a teenager, was behind the wheel. The crash was devastating. Madeleine sustained massive injuries that required extensive hospitalization and prolonged physical rehabilitation. The accident fundamentally shifted her perspective. Brushing against her own mortality stripped away the lingering illusions of her arrangement with the Johnson machine. She realized with terrifying clarity that if she had died in that wreckage, Stephen would be left entirely alone, legally tethered to a deceased schizophrenic and entirely dependent on the cold transactional goodwill of Jerome Ragsdale. The physical vulnerability she experienced during her recovery broke the remaining spell of the affair. The logistical nightmare of arranging meetings with a sitting president, combined with her physical limitations, effectively ended the intimate aspect of her relationship with LBJ. Their final face-to-face encounter occurred 2 years later in 1969. Lyndon Johnson was no longer the president. He had chosen not to seek re-election in 1968, driven from office by the catastrophic unpopularity of the Vietnam War and his own rapidly failing health. The meeting took place at the Shamrock Hotel in Houston. The dynamic had shifted entirely. The towering, intimidating political giant who had trapped her in 1948 was gone. In his place was a physically diminished, exhausted man facing his own mortality. The conversation at the Shamrock was not a cinematic reconciliation. It was the quiet closure of a 20-year covert operation. There were no grand apologies for the erasure of their son, no dismantling of the legal fictions Jerome Ragsdale had built. The financial arrangements remained in place, and the demand for silence remained absolute. They parted ways in the hotel, understanding that the structure they had built to protect his career would outlast them both. 4 years later, the final tether was cut. On January 22, 1973, Madeleine received a phone call from Jesse Kellum. It had been over 2 decades since Kellum had first called her office at KLIF Radio to arrange the initial meeting at the Driscoll Hotel. His tone was brief, factual, and devoid of sentiment. Lyndon Baines Johnson had suffered a massive heart attack at his ranch in Stonewall, Texas. He was dead. For Madeleine, the news did not bring immediate liberation. The architect of her silence was gone, but the machinery he had built, the falsified records, the financial dependencies, the deeply ingrained psychological fear remained fully operational. She was a woman in her late 40s, possessing a secret that could still detonate the legacy of an American president. The physical affair was over, but the true burden of the silence was only just beginning. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the silence Madeleine carried into the 1970s, the timeline must rewind a decade. The ultimate anchor binding her to Lyndon Johnson was not forged in a hotel room, but in the volatile political crosshairs of Dallas, directly prior to the darkest day of the Kennedy administration. By the autumn of 1963, the political atmosphere in Dallas, Texas was highly combustible. The city was not merely conservative, it was openly hostile to the federal government, and specifically to the administration of President John F. Kennedy. The gravity of Madeleine Duncan Brown's claims regarding the night of November 21st can only be weighed against the intersecting forces of power in Texas. These factions viewed the Kennedy brothers not just as political rivals, but as existential threats. The hostility was driven by 3 distinct factions, all of which held immense influence in Texas. First, the independent oil barons, led by men like H. L. Hunt and Clint Murchison. These men had built unimaginable fortunes largely due to the oil depletion allowance, a tax loophole that the Kennedy administration was actively seeking to eliminate. To the oilmen, JFK's economic policies were a direct assault on their empires. Second, the intelligence and law enforcement apparatus. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover viewed the Kennedy brothers, particularly Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, with profound contempt. Robert Kennedy had bypassed Hoover's established protocols, launching aggressive campaigns against organized crime and taking unprecedented control over the Justice Department. Hoover, who had operated as an untouchable autocrat for decades, found his authority actively being dismantled by men he considered arrogant upstarts. Third, the underworld. Organized crime syndicates had reportedly assisted the Kennedy campaign in securing crucial states like Illinois during the razor-thin 1960 election. In return, they expected a lenient Justice Department. Instead, Robert Kennedy declared total war on the mafia, deporting bosses and initiating relentless prosecutions. The feeling of betrayal among syndicate leaders was absolute, and caught squarely in the center of this volatile matrix was Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. By November 1963, LBJ was facing political extinction. His power in the Senate had been neutralized by the vice presidency, a role he despised for its impotence. Worse, he was engulfed in two massive escalating scandals involving his close associates, the Bobby Baker financial corruption case and the Billy Sol Estes agricultural fraud. Congressional investigations were closing in, and rumors were rampant that John F. Kennedy planned to drop Johnson from the Democratic ticket in the upcoming 1964 election. For LBJ, a man whose entire psychological framework was built on the acquisition and exercise of absolute power, the prospect of being cast out of Washington in disgrace was intolerable. He was cornered, desperate, and running out of time. This was the pressure cooker into which President Kennedy was scheduled to arrive on November 22nd. It was ostensibly a trip to unify the fracturing Texas Democratic Party. In reality, he was walking directly into hostile territory. On the evening of November 21st, less than 12 hours before the president's motorcade would roll through Dealey Plaza, Madeleine Brown attended a private gathering. According to her detailed testimonies given decades later, the event took place at the sprawling Dallas estate of Clint Murchison, the aforementioned oil tycoon. The stated purpose of the party was to honor FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and his closest associate, Clyde Tolson, who were reportedly visiting Texas. But the guest list, as Madeleine observed it, transformed the gathering from a standard high society function into an unprecedented assembly of Kennedy's most formidable enemies. Madeleine was 38 years old at the time. She had spent the last 15 years navigating the absolute highest tiers of Texas power. As LBJ's covert mistress, she knew the players, she knew the faces, and she knew how to read the temperature of a room. When she walked into the Murchison estate, the atmosphere was not celebratory, it was heavy with a cold, focused tension. She recognized the attendees immediately. There was H. L. Hunt, the eccentric billionaire who heavily funded anti-Kennedy propaganda across the South. There was George Brown of Brown and Root, the massive construction firm that had bankrolled LBJ's entire political career and relied heavily on federal military contracts. There was John J. McCloy, a Wall Street heavyweight, former president of the World Bank, and a central figure in the military-industrial complex. Most startlingly, Madeleine noted the presence of Richard Nixon, who had recently lost the California gubernatorial race and was currently representing Pepsi-Cola in a corporate legal capacity. Also present, mingling among the corporate titans and intelligence directors, were men Madeleine identified as high-ranking representatives of organized crime. To see these disparate factions, Wall Street, Texas Oil, the FBI, and the Mafia, in a single room was a terrifying anomaly. In the standard operation of American power, these groups maintained strict boundaries, interacting only through intermediaries. Their physical convergence at the Murchison estate indicated an alignment of interests that defied normal political behavior. They shared only one common denominator, an urgent, highly motivated desire to remove the Kennedy administration from power. The party operated in a low, simmering hum until late in the evening. The turning point arrived abruptly. At approximately 11 p.m., Vice President Lyndon Johnson arrived. According to Madeleine, LBJ did not come to socialize. His arrival immediately altered the gravitational pull of the room. He bypassed the standard pleasantries and swiftly moved toward a designated closed-door study. As he moved, the apex predators of the room detached from their conversations and followed him. Hoover, Tolson, Murchison, Hunt, McCloy, Nixon, and the others filed into the room behind the vice president. The heavy wooden doors were shut, locking the rest of the party out. For Madeleine, left standing in the opulent foyer, the psychological weight of that closed door was crushing. She understood the mechanics of power better than almost anyone outside that room. Men of that caliber did not gather in secret late at night on the eve of a presidential visit to discuss trivialities. They did not assemble unless a monumental decision required final alignment. She stood in the Murchison home, a highly trained observer, watching a critical mass of wealth and lethal capability isolate itself. The meeting was not brief. It extended late into the night, the silence from the study standing in stark contrast to the quiet murmurs of the remaining guests. Madeleine waited. The conditioning of her 15-year relationship with LBJ dictated her behavior. She did not leave until she was dismissed. She had to wait for him to emerge. When the doors finally opened, the change in Lyndon Johnson was physical and immediate. He was not projecting the polished, imposing confidence of a seasoned politician. He emerged in a state of high agitation. Madeleine noted that his face was heavily flushed, radiating a deep, angry red. His movements were jerky, tight with an adrenaline surge he was struggling to suppress. He looked like a man who had just crossed a point of no return. He spotted Madeleine and walked directly toward her. He did not offer a greeting. He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was not a gentle gesture of affection. It was brutal. His fingers dug deeply into her flesh, a physical manifestation of the immense internal pressure he was under. He leaned down, bringing his face close to hers, ensuring his words were meant for her alone, yet spoken with a venom that made his voice shake. He looked directly into her eyes and delivered a sentence that would echo through the rest of her life, a quote that she would later swear to on national television, under intense scrutiny and legal threat. After tomorrow, those goddamn Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's no threat. That's a promise. He did not elaborate. He did not wait for a response. He released her arm, turned, and rapidly exited the Murchison estate, flanked by his security detail, disappearing into the Dallas night. Madeleine stood frozen in the hallway. The physical pain in her arm was eclipsed by a sudden paralyzing clarity. LBJ's words were not the idle venting of a frustrated politician. Men like Johnson did not make promises they could not execute. He had just emerged from a room containing the financial and operational capital required to dismantle a government. She left the party shortly after, driving back to her home in South Windermere. The city of Dallas was asleep, quietly awaiting the arrival of the president the following morning. But for Madeleine Brown, the night of November 21st did not end. It stretched into a suffocating, terrifying dawn. She understood, with the cold certainty of an insider, that a mechanism had been triggered. She did not know the logistics, she did not know the operatives, and she did not know the exact timeline. But she knew the intent. As the sun rose over Texas on the morning of November 22, 1963, Madeleine Duncan Brown sat in her silent house watching the clock, waiting for the promise of the previous night to violently materialize. At 12:30 p.m. on November 22, 1963, the political reality of the United States was violently dismantled in Dealey Plaza. 3 shots rang out over the roar of the Dallas crowds. President John F. Kennedy's motorcade, meant to be a triumphant display of democratic unity, transformed instantly into a chaotic crime scene. Within 30 minutes, the president was declared dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital. For the American public, it was an unimaginable national tragedy. For Madeleine Duncan Brown, sitting in her home in South Windermere, it was the chilling execution of a promise. The news broadcast interrupted standard programming, sending shockwaves across the country. As Madeleine watched the black and white images of the panic in downtown Dallas, the words spoken to her just 13 hours earlier by Lyndon B. Johnson echoed in her mind with terrifying clarity. He had stood in the foyer of the Murchison estate, his face flushed with adrenaline, and vowed that the Kennedys would never embarrass him again. A few hours later, aboard the sweltering, overcrowded cabin of Air Force One, Lyndon Baines Johnson raised his right hand and took the oath of office. He was flanked by a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy and a cadre of somber Texas loyalists. The transfer of power was absolute and immediate. The man who had secretly controlled Madeleine's life for 15 years, the man who had forced her to hide their biological son behind falsified legal documents, was now the 36th president of the United States. He now commanded the military, the intelligence agencies, and the entire apparatus of the federal government. For Madeleine, the fear she had lived with since 1948 mutated into pure, paralyzing terror. She was no longer just the mistress of a powerful senator. She was a witness to the prologue of a presidential assassination. She held a secret that, if exposed, would not just end a political career, it would trigger a constitutional crisis and potentially tear the country apart. She waited in silence through the chaotic aftermath of the assassination. She watched Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused lone gunman, paraded before the press. She watched the narrative of the deranged communist sympathizer rapidly take shape across every major media outlet. And then, 2 days later, she watched Jack Ruby step out from a crowd of reporters in the basement of the Dallas Police headquarters and shoot Oswald dead on live television. The public saw a grieving, patriotic nightclub owner taking revenge. Madeleine saw a desperate cleanup operation executed by a man she personally recognized. Dallas was a large city, but the circles of power and vice were incredibly small. Madeleine's position in the media industry, combined with the affluent lifestyle funded by the Johnson machine, meant she was familiar with the city's nightlife. She knew Jack Ruby. The Carousel Club, Ruby's burlesque joint, was a known hub where local police, politicians, and underworld figures mingled. According to Madeleine's later testimonies, her knowledge of the conspiracy did not begin at the Murchison party. It had been foreshadowed weeks earlier. In the fall of 1963, she claimed to have been at the Carousel Club and witnessed a quiet, intense meeting between Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. Furthermore, she asserted she had overheard Ruby openly boasting about Oswald's marksmanship, specifically referencing a failed assassination attempt on Major General Edwin Walker, a radical right-wing figure in Dallas earlier that year. At the time, she had dismissed it as the standard boastful noise of the Dallas underworld. But watching Ruby silence Oswald on national television, the scattered pieces of the puzzle locked together. The mafia, the local police connections, the intelligence operatives, and the oil tycoons at the Murchison estate, they were all moving parts of a singular machine, and LBJ was at the helm. The ultimate, terrifying confirmation of this reality occurred a month later. On New Year's Eve, December the 31st, 1963, Madeleine received the call she had been dreading. It was time for a meeting. The location was the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, the exact same building where their clandestine affair had begun 15 years prior. But the dynamics had shifted completely. The Driscoll was now heavily fortified by the United States Secret Service. When Madeleine was escorted into the private suite, she was not facing the combative vice president she had seen in November. She was facing the commander-in-chief. The tension in the room was suffocating. Madeleine, driven to the edge of a nervous breakdown by a month of silent panic, finally broke protocol. She bypassed the pleasantries and confronted him directly. She asked him if he was responsible for what happened in Dealey Plaza. Johnson's response, as Madeleine would later recount it, was devoid of any defensive anger. It was a cold, calculated admission. He did not claim to have pulled the trigger, nor did he claim to have drawn up the operational blueprints. Instead, he confirmed the broad architecture of the coup. He looked at her and stated bluntly that the assassination was the work of Texas oil interests and renegade intelligence bastards in Washington. He admitted that the forces who despised Kennedy had aligned, and he had stepped out of their way, allowing the execution to proceed so he could step into the vacuum of power. This New Year's Eve confirmation finalized the construction of Madeleine's invisible prison. By admitting his complicity, LBJ tied an absolute anchor around her neck. He was essentially telling her, you know the truth, you know who did it, and you know what happens to people who become liabilities. From 1964 onward, Madeleine's life became an exercise in extreme psychological endurance. She was raising a teenage son, Stephen, who was growing increasingly curious about his origins, and his Uncle Jerome Ragsdale, the attorney who continued to manage their finances. The hush money continued to flow. The house in South Windermere was paid for. The credit cards remained active, but the money felt entirely different now. It was blood money. It was a monthly reminder that she was being paid to cover up the murder of an American president. The Johnson administration moved forward, accelerating the Vietnam War and passing landmark civil rights legislation. LBJ was reshaping the world. Meanwhile, Madeleine was watching her world shrink. She lived in a state of acute paranoia. She noticed vehicles idling too long on her street. She experienced strange clicks and echoes on her telephone line. Whether she was actually under constant surveillance by federal agents or simply suffering from the profound psychological trauma of her situation, the outcome was the same. She was trapped. Her fear was consistently reinforced by the external reality of the 1960s and 1970s. The people adjacent to the JFK assassination began to die. It was a slow, methodical attrition of witnesses, journalists, and operatives. Jack Ruby died in prison of a sudden, aggressive cancer before he could face a retrial. George de Mohrenschildt, a key figure in Oswald's life, committed suicide just hours before he was scheduled to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Dozens of peripheral figures met violent or suspicious ends. Madeleine watched the body count rise. She understood that her survival depended entirely on her absolute irrelevance to the public narrative. If she made any noise, if she attempted to contact a journalist, or if she told her son the truth, she would simply become another tragic, unexplained statistic in the Dallas police files. She retreated. She focused entirely on Stephen. She maintained the lie that his father was the institutionalized James Glenn Brown. She played the role of the quiet, respectable media professional. Even when Lyndon Johnson passed away in January 1973, she did not break. The system he had built was too vast, and the operatives who had executed the 1963 plot, the intelligence officers, and the oilmen were still very much alive and in control. The 1970s bled into the 1980s. The world moved on from the Kennedy assassination, relegating it to the realm of historical debate and conspiracy theories. The Warren Commission had issued its massive, heavily sanitized report, officially declaring Oswald the lone gunman. The government had closed the book. Madeleine Duncan Brown aged into her 60s. The trauma of her life, the abusive first marriage, the suffocating 15-year affair with a political titan, the burden of a hidden son, and the crushing weight of the November 21st secret took a heavy physical toll. She had survived the predators of Dallas by remaining entirely invisible. But silence, held for that long, becomes a poison. It corrodes the spirit. She was approaching the end of her life, and the son she had fought so hard to protect was now a grown man, still living inside the faction designed by Jerome Ragsdale in 1950. The machinery of power had won every battle. It had taken her youth, her autonomy, and her truth. But as the 1980s progressed and her health began to rapidly decline, Madeleine realized that she possessed one final explosive weapon against the legacy of Lyndon Baines Johnson. She had nothing left to lose. The invisible prison was about to be broken. Secrets of a certain magnitude do not simply fade, they metabolize. For over 3 decades, Madeleine Duncan Brown carried the weight of a covert presidential affair, a falsified bloodline, and the chilling foreknowledge of a presidential assassination. She internalized the paranoia, the constant surveillance, and the unspoken threat of the Johnson political machine. But the human body is not built to sustain that level of chronic psychological stress indefinitely. The toll is eventually exacted on the physical form. By the mid-1980s, Madeleine's health began to fail. The hardened, impeccably dressed media executive who had navigated the shark-infested waters of Dallas high society was now an aging woman grappling with severe cardiac deterioration. She had spent her entire adult life calculating the odds of her survival, staying quiet to protect her son, Stephen Mark Brown, from the lethal collateral damage of the men who controlled Washington. But survival is a finite game. In February 1987, the biological clock ran out on the silence. Madeleine suffered a massive heart attack. Rushed to the hospital and placed in intensive care, she was confronted with the immediate visceral reality of her own mortality. The doctors offered a grim prognosis, Believing she had only days, perhaps hours left to live, her priorities radically shifted. The fear of Lyndon B. Johnson's retaliation, a fear that had governed her every move since 1948, was suddenly eclipsed by a much deeper, primal fear, taking the truth to her grave and leaving her son anchored to a manufactured lie. She summoned Stephen to her hospital bed. Stephen was 36 years old at the time. His entire existence had been defined by legal fictions and strategic omissions. He had grown up believing his father was a violently schizophrenic ex-Marine, James Glenn Brown, whom he never knew. He had been raised under the financial supervision of Jerome Ragsdale, the powerful Dallas attorney who acted as a stern, distant uncle. Stephen's life was a puzzle missing its central pieces. In that sterile hospital room, struggling for breath, Madeleine finally detonated the lie. She looked at her son and stripped away the 36-year cover-up. She explained the Adolphus Hotel, the Driscoll Hotel Rendezvous, and the mechanics of the Johnson machine. She told him that James Glenn Brown was merely a name on a piece of paper, a convenient ghost utilized by the political elite. She told him that his biological father was Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States. For Stephen, the revelation was a psychological earthquake. The confession did not offer peace, it offered an enraging clarity. The sudden influx of wealth during his childhood, the shadowy presence of Jerome Ragsdale, the strange, isolated nature of his mother's social life. Everything abruptly made sense. But the clarity was accompanied by a profound sense of theft. He realized that his identity, his inheritance, and his basic right to know his own bloodline had been stolen to protect the political ambitions of a man who refused to acknowledge his existence. Stephen Mark Brown did not react with quiet acceptance. He reacted with the aggressive indignation of a man who discovers his entire life has been a carefully managed operation. He decided to fight back. The battlefield he chose was the Texas legal system. In 1987, armed with his mother's deathbed confession, though Madeleine miraculously survived the heart attack and began a slow recovery, Stephen filed an explosive $10.5 million lawsuit against the estate of Lyndon B. Johnson. The primary defendant named in the suit was Lady Bird Johnson, the former First Lady and the fiercely protective guardian of the LBJ legacy. But the lawsuit went further, legally outlining the mechanics of the conspiracy. Stephen formally accused Lady Bird, along with LBJ's key operatives, specifically Jesse Kellum and Jerome Ragsdale, of orchestrating a multi-decade conspiracy to deprive him of his rightful inheritance. The legal filing demanded a full accounting of the estate and, crucially, a court-ordered DNA test to definitively establish paternity. The lawsuit was a direct frontal assault on one of the most powerful political families in American history. Stephen was not just suing for money, he was suing for historical recognition. He was demanding that the American legal system force the Johnson machine to admit what it had done in the dark. The moment the lawsuit was filed, the containment protocols that Madeleine had feared for decades were breached. The secret was out. Realizing that she was now fully exposed and that her son was standing in the crosshairs of a ruthless legal and political establishment, Madeleine made a tactical decision. She could no longer rely on the shadows for protection. Her only defense was radical transparency. If she was going to be targeted, she would make sure the whole world was watching. Madeleine Duncan Brown stepped into the national spotlight. In 1988, she made her first major television appearance on the nationally syndicated program American Exposé, who murdered JFK. She did not just confirm Stephen's lawsuit, she escalated the narrative significantly. For the first time, the American public heard the chilling account of the Murchison Party on November 21st, 1963. She detailed the gathering of the oil barons, the mafia figures, and the intelligence operatives. She looked directly into the camera and recounted LBJ's promise that the Kennedys would never embarrass me again. Her appearances sent shockwaves through the historical community and the media. She followed up with interviews on a current affair in 1992, refusing to back down from her claims. She was articulate, unshakable, and entirely direct. She did not sound like a deranged conspiracy theorist. She sounded exactly like what she was, a hardened insider who had survived the brutal reality of Texas politics. But the court of public opinion is fundamentally different from a court of law. While Madeleine was dominating the television screens, Stephen was being systematically dismantled in the legal arena. The Johnson estate did not respond with public panic. They responded with the cold, crushing efficiency of unlimited legal capital. They deployed a battery of high-powered attorneys who immediately began suffocating Stephen's lawsuit in procedural motions, jurisdictional challenges, and demands for evidentiary standards that a man born into a cover-up could not possibly meet. The legal strategy of the Johnson estate was not to prove LBJ wasn't the father. It was to ensure the question never reached a courtroom floor where a DNA test could be compelled. They weaponized the legal system against him. The lawsuit dragged on for 2 grueling years. Stephen, lacking the immense financial resources of the LBJ estate, found himself drowning in legal fees and administrative roadblocks. In 1989, the Texas legal system delivered its verdict. The $10.5 million lawsuit was abruptly dismissed. The official reason cited by the judge was failure to appear. It was an ambiguous, deeply unsatisfying conclusion. Stephen's legal representation had faltered. The procedural hurdles became insurmountable, and the court effectively threw the case out without ever addressing the core claim of paternity. The Johnson estate successfully maintained its firewall. Lady Bird Johnson never had to answer a single question under oath. The dismissal was a devastating blow, but Stephen refused to surrender. He began preparing a new legal strategy, intending to refile the case and aggressively pursue the DNA testing that would circumvent the procedural blocks. The technology of DNA profiling was rapidly advancing in the late 1980s, becoming an indisputable biological ledger. Stephen knew that if he could just force the test, the entire Johnson empire would have to rewrite its history. But the Johnson machine, whether through fate or darker interventions, never had to face that test. In 1990, just as Stephen was regrouping for a second legal assault, he fell ill. What began as mild fatigue rapidly escalated into a catastrophic medical crisis. He was diagnosed with lymphatic cancer. Cancer is an unpredictable disease, but the pathology of Stephen Mark Brown's illness was startling in its velocity. It did not progress, it exploded. Within weeks of the diagnosis, his body was completely overrun. The man who had spent 3 years aggressively fighting the most powerful estate in Texas was suddenly confined to a hospital bed, physically destroyed. Before any new legal motions could be filed, before any biological samples could be secured for future DNA profiling, and before the public could fully grasp the implications of his lawsuit, Stephen Mark Brown died. He was 39 years old. The timing of his death was, to objective observers, highly convenient. To those who understood the lethal capabilities of the forces Madeleine had implicated, it was deeply suspect. Stephen's sudden, aggressive illness effectively neutralized the greatest biological threat to the legacy of Lyndon Baines Johnson. With Stephen dead, the demand for a DNA test died with him. The legal standing to sue the estate vanished. The physical evidence of the affair was permanently erased. Madeleine Duncan Brown was left standing entirely alone. She had finally broken her silence. She had risked everything to give her son his true identity, and the result was total devastation. The legal system had crushed their claims, and a suspiciously aggressive disease had taken her child. The invisible cage she had lived in for 40 years had been shattered, but the forces outside the cage proved to be just as deadly as she had always feared. The empire had protected itself, leaving Madeleine with nothing but her memories, a dead son, and a story the establishment was determined to discredit. The death of Stephen Mark Brown in 1990 removed the physical evidence of Madeleine Duncan Brown's claims, but it did not silence her. Grief did not force her back into the shadows, it weaponized her. Operating with the dangerous freedom of a woman who had lost everything, she decided to bypass the legal system entirely. If the courts would not validate her truth, she would take her case directly to the court of public opinion. In 1997, Madeleine self-published her memoir, Texas in the Morning, the love story of Madeleine Brown and President Lyndon Baines Johnson. The decision to self-publish was not merely a business choice, it was a tactical necessity. Major publishing houses employ rigorous legal and fact-checking departments, particularly when a manuscript accuses a former United States president of orchestrating the murder of his predecessor. Madeleine circumvented this institutional barrier. The resulting book was a highly sensational, unfiltered account of her life. It delivered exactly what the burgeoning conspiracy community demanded: a clear narrative, a recognizable villain, and a smoking gun quote that perfectly aligned with their pre-existing suspicions of Lyndon B. Johnson. The memoir secured her status as a martyr within fringe historical circles. She became a highly sought-after speaker at JFK assassination symposiums. Audiences listened, captivated by the articulate, immaculately dressed elderly woman who spoke with the hardened authority of a true Texas insider. But television interviews and self-published memoirs are strictly controlled environments. They are one-sided broadcasts. When Madeleine's claims were finally subjected to the rigorous, multi-directional cross-examination of independent historians, investigative journalists, and legal scholars, the architecture of her story began to buckle. The disintegration of her narrative did not come from government pushback. It came from the cold, inflexible reality of the documented historical record. The first catastrophic blow to her credibility involved the core foundation of her story, the paternity of Stephen Mark Brown and the timeline of her confession. Madeleine's central claim on national television was that Stephen lived his entire life in the dark, believing the institutionalized James Glenn Brown was his father. She swore that it was only during her near-fatal heart attack in February 1987 that she finally broke down and revealed LBJ was his true biological father, prompting Stephen's immediate $10.5 million lawsuit. The legal archives of Dallas County told a fundamentally different story. Independent researchers unearthed the files of Brown versus Crockett, a probate lawsuit filed in 1980. The plaintiff in this case was Stephen Mark Brown. The target of the lawsuit was the estate of Jerome T. Ragsdale, the wealthy Dallas attorney and LBJ operative who had functioned as Stephen's surrogate uncle and financial guardian. Ragsdale had died in 1978. In this 1980 lawsuit, filed 7 years before Madeleine's alleged deathbed confession, Stephen legally petitioned the court to be recognized not as the son of LBJ, but as the biological son of Jerome T. Ragsdale. Stephen's legal filings explicitly asserted that Ragsdale was his true father, and he produced witnesses, including family members, who testified that Ragsdale had privately acknowledged the boy as his own. Stephen filed this suit in a direct attempt to claim a portion of Ragsdale's massive estate. This documented legal maneuver obliterated Madeleine's 1987 narrative. It proved that Stephen was not a naive son blindsided by a deathbed revelation. He was actively utilizing the ambiguity of his paternity to litigate for inheritance years prior. When the Ragsdale lawsuit failed to yield the desired financial outcome, the target shifted to an even larger, more lucrative estate, that of Lyndon B. Johnson. The discovery of the 1980 lawsuit transformed the perception of the 1987 LBJ lawsuit from a righteous quest for truth into a calculated, opportunistic grab for capital. The second, equally devastating strike against Madeleine's credibility dismantled the most explosive element of her entire public persona, the November 21st, 1963, gathering at the Murchison estate. Madeleine had staked her reputation on the claim that she saw LBJ walk into a closed-door meeting with Richard Nixon, J. Edgar Hoover, and Texas oil barons in Dallas at 11 p.m., emerging to explicitly promise the destruction of the Kennedy administration. Assassination researchers, relying on primary source documents rather than testimony, reconstructed the exact movements of Vice President Johnson on the night of November 21st. The timeline was not a matter of debate. It was heavily documented by White House logs, Secret Service schedules, local press reports, and photographic evidence. On the evening of November 21st, LBJ was not in Dallas. He was in Houston. Johnson attended a dinner at the Rice Hotel in Houston with President Kennedy. Following the dinner, both men attended a massive gathering at the Sam Houston Coliseum. They did not depart Houston until after 10 p.m. Air Force Two, carrying the Vice President, landed at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth at exactly 11:07 p.m. Following the landing, LBJ traveled via motorcade to the Hotel Texas in downtown Fort Worth. He is heavily photographed arriving at the hotel at 11:50 p.m., where he stayed the night. Fort Worth is roughly 35 miles from Dallas. It was physically, geographically, and logistically impossible for Lyndon B. Johnson to have attended a secret meeting at Clint Murchison's Dallas estate at 11 p.m. Furthermore, the supporting cast of this alleged shadow summit dissolved under scrutiny. Official FBI travel logs confirmed that Director J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson were in Washington, D.C. on November 21st. Clint Murchison Sr., the supposed host of the gathering, had suffered a severe stroke and was living quietly in East Texas, miles away from the Dallas social scene. The Dallas property Madeleine described actually belonged to Murchison's son, John, and his wife, Lupe. When questioned, Lupe Murchison firmly denied hosting any such party on the eve of the assassination. Val M., the highly meticulous society editor for the Dallas Times-Herald, whose entire career was dedicated to tracking elite gatherings in the city, confirmed there was absolutely no record, rumor, or trace of a party at the Murchison home that night. Historians concluded that Madeleine had likely conflated a different high society gathering, possibly an event she attended years later, in 1969, with the timeline of the assassination to insert herself into the center of the historical narrative. The final fatal blow to Madeleine's public standing was not historical. It was criminal. In November 1992, at the height of her media prominence, Madeleine Duncan Brown was indicted and stood trial in Texas. The charge was forgery. She was accused of altering the last will and testament of an elderly deceased relative in a blatant attempt to seize control of their estate. The trial was brief and brutal. The prosecution presented evidence demonstrating a clear pattern of financial manipulation. The jury convicted her. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. While an appellate court later overturned the conviction in 1994 on a highly specific technicality, ruling that prosecutors could not definitively prove Madeleine physically held the pen that forged the signature, even if she orchestrated the scheme, the damage was permanent. Her credibility was completely exhausted. To the mainstream media and the historical establishment, she was no longer a whistleblower. She was a legally recognized fraudster with a documented history of weaponizing the probate courts for financial gain. Madeleine Duncan Brown spent the final years of her life largely marginalized. She continued to give occasional interviews to fringe outlets, refusing to recant a single word of her story. She maintained her defiance until her death on June 22, 2002. She died with her claims thoroughly debunked by the establishment, yet deeply revered by those who believed the establishment was exactly what she was fighting against. The legacy of Madeleine Duncan Brown requires us to separate factual accuracy from historical utility. Under the strict, unforgiving light of objective investigation, her narrative collapses. The timelines do not align, the legal records contradict her motives, and the physical impossibilities of her claims render them historically void. She was not the secret key to unlocking the Kennedy assassination. However, her story endures precisely because it expertly mirrored the profound cynicism of the American public. People wanted to believe her because the man she described, a ruthless, power-obsessed politician willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to secure his dominance, perfectly matched the public's darkest suspicions about Lyndon B. Johnson and the systemic corruption of the 1960s. Madeleine Brown may have fabricated the details of the crime, but the psychological portrait she painted of unchecked political power, absolute intimidation, and the devastating collateral damage inflicted on those caught in its wake remains a chilling and accurate reflection of